So let's go back to our diary for a moment. And one of the issues here is that we're showing elements in our links that might be unnecessary. Like is templated equals false, we can assume it's not templated and maybe not even show this property. And so we might want to make the decision when we're generating these to only generate the ones we actually have to have. What I'd like to have happen is that the link is going to be an href and a rel, and assuming the method is get, unless we say it's not get, like it is here in post. And the same for isTemplated. Show the property is templated only if the isTemplated equals true. So the problem with this is that you might very easily think, oh, I'm going to have to drop down into anonymous objects or things like that in order to get that behavior. And so this represents a good place where we can actually show you how serialization is separated from the implementation of the API in Web API. The way this works is if we look at the configuration, and because JavaScript is a loosely typed language, we can get away with doing this. We might not do this in our XML formatter because we need to maintain a consistency of DTE that an object always is going to have certain elements. But in our case, let's go ahead and change this by saying JSON formatter .serialization settings .converters. Now, a converter is this idea of an object that knows how to convert certain types into and out of JSON. So we're going to actually add a new converter called, surprise, surprise, link model converter. And we're going to simply add that to the collection of converters. Let's create a new directory for converters because we might have a handful of them. And let's go ahead and create our new converter class directly in that new folder. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and fix up the namespace here and just include it in our config so we don't have to come back and deal with that later. So a link model converter can derive from a JSON converter. This is a class that is exposed by newtonsoft.json, the json.net project that's used for all of our serialization. And it has 3 required methods. The JSON converter class itself is abstract, so it has certain required methods that you have to fill out. So let's go ahead and just stub them out for us. And the first thing we're going to want to do is determine that the type that is being passed through the system is something that this converter can handle. And the way you do this is in the can convert, you return true or false based on looking at the type that's being converted. So in our case, we're simply going to say if object type is equal to the type of link model. Now, there are other ways of doing this. You could say is equivalent to or can be derived from. There are other ways of doing this, but for our case, we know that there's only one and one type of link model. Later on, we might want to create some different derivations of this and do something different here. But for the simplest case, we're just going to say this converter can handle it if the type being converted is a link model. Now, when JSON.NET reads JSON coming in and wants to convert it to an object, we're going to let it. We're just going to say reader.value. So we're basically going to tell it, go ahead and use the default implementation, which is to read all the properties on the JSON object and apply them one-to-one to our link model. Because we don't really have an override, we want to deal with that. If there's something different in the way we're structuring it, we may need to actually implement this read JSON manually. But in our case, we don't. For us, the real magic comes here, and that is where we want to write our own version of the JSON. We're going to first get an instance of the object, the value, by saying value as link model. We're doing as so that we can then just make sure that we're only doing something special here if the value being passed in actually is a link model. This should always be true, but it's just a sort of a sanity check I like to put in. You could also say if value is not a link model, then throw an exception so that the user knows that. It's really up to you which path you want to go down. So we're going to start this by using the writer, and we're going to say write start object. Because we're telling it that we want to start an object in the JSON. It's going to know that the writer is at the point where our link has to be injected into the JSON stream. And we're going to say we're going to write an object, so let's start that object. We're also going to end it with write end object as bookmarks to the actual implementation we want. So let's first write our first element, which is going to be write property name, and here we're going to write a property name of href. We're also going to write the value, which is going to be our model, model.href. This is how a single property and value are written into the JSON object. Now, if we wanted to rename these in some way, we would then, in our read, have to do that conversion between the names as well. But they're the same, so we can just deal with it in that way. And we'll do the same here for rel. And this is where we're actually doing some overriding. What we want to do is say if model.method does not equal to get, or let's do it the really proper way, which is equals get compare ordinal ignore case. So if it's get, even if they've mistyped the casing, if it's not get, we can go ahead and write out the method. And in this way, we're only going to include the method if the value is not a get. And we can copy the same behavior by saying if model is templated. So if templated is true, we can go ahead and expose is templated. So the assumption that it would be false if it's not included. When we look at our results now, we're going to see that the formation of the JSON for the links now only includes self and href because those are the ones that are going to be simpler and easier to understand. That a get to the href is going to return this exact object, and that a post to this href is going to create a new diary entry. This is going to allow us to format what links look like in our actual ending code. So you now have the notion of links across the API, and so we're really fulfilling the self-describing nature of our REST interface as well as supporting hypermedia and HADOS. Let's look at the other constraints.